this Facebook breach. What do you make of it, and how, in your opinion, has Facebook handled it so far?
Well, of course, I'm sorry to see this news. We've been working for many years to try to strengthen privacy protections for the personal data that's collected by internet firms like Facebook. But I also have real concern at this point that the Federal Trade Commission here in Washington actually could have done something to stop this from happening. There's a pending order against Facebook to protect data. FTC said back in March, after Cambridge Analytica, they were going to reopen the investigation, but 6 months have passed. There's been no report, there's been no fine, and now we have another data breach. So we can talk about what Facebook should have done, but I think we should also start talking about what the Federal Trade Commission should do.
Shira, I'm tempted to just ask you, can Facebook catch a break in 2018?
Well, on the one hand, a day of chaos in Washington is maybe a good day to announce a massive security vulnerability, but no, it does seem like Facebook keeps stepping in it, and it's contributing to this loss of faith that we've seen at Facebook this year, these repeated scandals. And it does seem like Facebook did the right thing this time with the security vulnerability, that it disclosed it relatively quickly. It said it's investigating, it notified law enforcement, it went through all the appropriate steps. But anytime you have the words Facebook and security vulnerability in the same headline in 2018, it brings up all those old concerns about Cambridge Analytica, about Russian propaganda around the election, around all kinds of data misuse at Facebook. And it just underscores that this loss of trust in Facebook is not something that's going to be re-won anytime soon.
So, Mark, as Facebook is explaining this data breach, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, is in D.C. meeting with 24 lawmakers. It's kind of an omnibus meeting. You've got privacy, you've got its efforts in China, you've got the issue of like an ideological bias slanted against conservatives. But let's take the privacy issue. What kind of questions will Sundar get, and what does he have to answer for in terms of Google and privacy?
Well, I think the privacy issue is actually the big issue. I know he was brought to Washington to address some of the concerns about anti-conservative bias on the search platform. But what the state attorney generals want to talk about, and I think what others want to talk about, is what's going to happen with the personal data that Google is collecting, still not subject to privacy protection, and also the recent news of this project in China called Dragonfly, which I got to say, I've been doing privacy stuff for a long time, but it's still possible to be scared. And Dragonfly is scary because what Google was proposing to do for the Chinese government was not only to keep all search histories, but to tie all search records to identifiable users using their telephone number. And that would be essentially perfect surveillance for the use of the internet. Google said that they're not sure this is going to go ahead. There's been a lot of question about it. Their privacy officer, Kevin Enright, testified this week in the Senate Commerce Committee. But I think lawmakers are going to ask about that as well. That is not a good direction for a U.S. firm to be heading.
Yeah, well, and let's be clear, if China does want to, if Google does want to compete in China, it probably thinks it needs to play by the rules of the game there, and so it's creating a search engine that would please the Chinese government. But Shira, let me just ask you, why? Why does Google want to go back into China? It left in 2010. The search market there is basically lost to Baidu. What do you think the company's strategic goals are?
I got to tell you, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, is why is Google doing this? It can't possibly believe that it's going to make a dent in the search market in China, where, as you said, Baidu rules. And Google was losing market share even in 2010 when it got hacked to bits and pulled out of the country. So from what I understand, Google believes it wants to do other kinds of business in China. It believes that its artificial intelligence and cloud and maybe other business-to-business kind of services that Google provides, China is a fertile and wide-open market for those kinds of Google services. And I guess it believes that it needs to do search if it does AI and cloud and other things in China. I don't necessarily see how the two are connected, but I'm not in those negotiations with China. But the problem is that, Google Google has just been incredibly disingenuous about its explorations of resuming search in China, and it has been justifiably raked over the coals in Washington for some of the work it has done internally to prepare for if and when that happens. And there's so many questions about what Google might do in China that Google has entirely sidestepped.
Mark, is there any conscientious way for Google to go to China?
Well, I think it should continue to promote internet use and access to information online without restriction. Those are very important values. They're universal values. I think they're respected in the technical and engineering community. There's always a need, of course, to accommodate local governments when you move into their markets. But I was really taken aback here because Google really has pushed for a number of years to oppose censorship, and now with China they are developing what would be the world's most advanced surveillance search service, and that just can't be right.
Shira, let me ask you one last question here as we're nearly running out of time. This question of ideological bias, do conservatives have a legitimate reason to be concerned about this?
I would say yes and no. So I don't think there's legitimacy to some of the claims that President Trump and others have made that Google is suppressing conservative viewpoints. I just don't think there's evidence of that. But the Google search and other Google services are incredibly powerful. They are incredibly influential in what we see and read or don't see and read. And we just don't really know what gets baked into the algorithm that determines those things. And that causes naturally suspicion, and it should.